Good afternoon and welcome to the Boston Public Library. And we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement here. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, Free for All. And now we'd like to welcome all of you here for this presentation from the Boston Wagner Society. Today's presenter is William Berger, and we're very thrilled to have him speak. He is an author, radio music host, and commentator. For 5 years, he worked at the San Francisco Opera. He was responsible for acquiring the company's record collection. As an author, he has written many books on music, which you may have seen outside, including the Wagner Without Fear, Verdi with a Vengeance, Puccini Without Excuses, that were all published by Random House. He has also written opera libretti and articles on religion and architecture. He frequently gives lectures on operatic music and composers, and is also a radio commentator and has been recently a regular host for the New York Public Radio's Overnight Music and WNYC Radio. Since creation of the Metropolitan Opera Radio on Sirius in fall of 2006, he writes all the commentaries heard during soundtracks of historical broadcasts. He is currently the commentator during live Metropolitan Opera radio broadcast and is often the moderator of those broadcasts' Met Opera quiz. So please give a warm round of applause for William Berger. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming here on this miserable day. And boy, do I need to update that bio. Yeah, I am the commentator at the Metropolitan Opera, and in fact was last night. So quick turnaround for the performance of Turandot, more on which in a moment, because we've got some issues with that one. We've got some issues with all of them. We hear a lot of talk these days. Well, we hear a lot of talk that we should have been hearing the whole time in the performing arts about racism and systemic suppression, all the isms. And especially now as we reopen post-pandemic in that process, we have to ask a lot of questions. One, how do we reopen? For whom are we reopening? Who are we? And what is our mission? So what are we talking about here? What am I talking about today? Well, what does it mean to say a work from the past is racist or toxic in some way? And then what do we do about it? Can you genuinely detoxify something, decolonialize, whatever you want to call it? Should we? Should we not discuss the problem at all because there's no point in it and we've already discussed it? Or conversely, as many people would say, should we dispense with tainted works from the past altogether? Well, those of us who are here because we have a specific interest in Wagner, which is a lot of us, we've been grappling with questions like this for a long time. We've been grappling with questions before they were fashionable. We've had to. I've been waiting, about 50 years now, to turn into the fascist everyone said I must be deep down because I responded to this art. It hasn't happened yet. I don't think it's going to. I've made it this far. However, as someone with an interest in this who has had to justify my love for that and other things, but especially Wagner, the intersection of all controversy, we have some experience on this subject, on toxic art. We have some experience to share with the general population of what have we discovered. And we also have a duty, that's an icky word, but let's use it for the moment, to be open to reassessing what we think we've learned in the last 150 years, can you believe it, of asking these questions. Okay, now, that's what I'm here to talk about here in 2021. Now, I've been out on book tour. I don't mind telling you. I've learned how to hype my own work. It's not as hard as I thought it would be. And I've learned a lot about what's on people's minds today. Let's say post-pandemic. I know we're not post-pandemic, but you know what I mean. In 2021. And I gave a seminar, a webinar, dreaded word, for the San Francisco Opera in March. They were presenting The Ring of the Nibelung. And they said, do we need to have a talk about controversial issues in The Ring? And I said, yes, you do. And I need to do it. And I did it. So I'm not going to be saying this, and I wrote it up, and it happens to be in my new book, available at the merch table. But what I'm talking about today is parallel to that, but it is not the same. If you happen to catch it, many people did, that webinar, Confronting Controversy. It's not the same because we're not the same as we were in March. It's amazing how it's an entirely different world. And a month ago when I started this book tour, things are not the same. I am not the same, and neither are you. Neither is all the art in question. Harlan Ellison said, time is a river flowing into nowhere. We knew that from The Ring of the Nibelung. We knew that you can't step into the same river twice, even if you step in at the same place. So that's one way in which things are different from the March webinar, but also we've been performing Die Meistersinger von Nürnberg. I'm working on it. I'm working on my German diction. At the Met, and I've been immersed in that in the rehearsal process. And I referred to Meistersinger in the San Francisco webinar, but I had to talk about The Ring at that. But I really wanted to talk about Meistersinger. And so I'm really excited to have a Wagner Society with me so we can talk about that. And I know there are people here, as always with my work, there are people here who have never heard it, and there are people here who know more about it than Richard Wagner knew. That's great. And my job, which is not easy, is to hit all of you at the same time, so let's see if I can do that. I'm thinking Robert Shaw used to tell his choristers with chestnuts like the Hallelujah Chorus or Beethoven's Ninth. Not that that's a chestnut, but you know what I mean. So you have to remember that there's somebody in the audience here who's hearing this for the first time, and you have to remember that there's somebody in the audience who's hearing this for the last time. And I try and keep with that, like when I do. Fun fact, I've done more live broadcasts of La Bohème, Rigoletto, and The Ring than anybody. I don't know what that has to do with, but it's always possible to find something new to say, even if you've written a book on it. Now, the problems that people are talking about in toxicity in the arts are very abundant and concentrated in the works of Richard Wagner. But here's the surprising part. So are some of the solutions. So let's look at that. One of the things we have to look at, as I suggested, I keep leaning over to this. Maybe I can pick it up. I'll put it on something. I'll lift it up. One of the things I suggested is that the problems and solutions are different today than they were in the past when we talked about it. Here's a weird thing to think about. When Wieland and Wolfgang Wagner, Wagner's grandsons, had to reopen the Wagner Festival at Bayreuth after World War II, famous New Bayreuth, and they literally called, the process was literally called denazification in that time. Well, that was in 1951. That was 70 years ago. So the questions that they had to answer, did I just mess everything up on sound? Okay. I dread when I see the sound guy coming because I know I've messed things up. So leave it. Don't pick it up. I'm popping. Wow, after all this time on radio, I still pop.
Just give it a boost.
Parsifal. Yeah. Okay. 70 years ago was the reopening of New Bayreuth. 70 years before that, Wagner was alive between the first and second Bayreuth festivals, between the premiere of the complete Ring of the Nibelung and Parsifal. Parsifal. That's crazy to think about. So the solutions that Wieland came up with, how do we denazify this work? We need to reassess again. You're thinking, oh my God, do we have to talk about this stuff again? Yes, we have to do what Wieland and Wolfgang did all over again and completely different at the same time, but as thoroughly. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to assess what the problems are today, not what we thought they were in 1951, or for that matter, 2019. We need to determine what we can and must do to keep these works as part of our cultural landscape if we want to, in a way that preserves that which is worth preserving in them. In other words, we need to make it clear what we think these works are and what they're not. And how do we do that? We do that with context. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And then we need to share these discoveries with the wider arts world for their input, and if we do a good enough job, for everyone's edification, including our own. All right. Let's talk about race and nation to start. Some of the problems with race and nationalism in Wagner's operas are not so much visible as they are thematic. By that I mean when you have, say, Turandot or Madame Butterfly or Otello, Verdi's Otello in blackface, the whole issue of do we do it in blackface? No. Do we do Turandot in yellowface? No, but this is a controversy that's being hammered out now, not always in a nice way. The issues are not as plainly visible in what we see on stage. They were at one point. There was the question in a traditional performance of the Ring of the Nibelung if Alberich, the uber bad guy, the proto bad guy, was a prototype of the eternal Jew that the Third Reich was so concerned about. And in his representation, did you make him look like the woodcuts of the eternal Jew that you found in Nazi publications? So there was a visual component, but this is not the case for us in many ways. One, if you take the original production of 1876 and look at Alberich now, none of us are steeped in the propaganda of the Third Reich. It doesn't trigger like, oh, that he's obviously pointing to the signs and symbols of being the prototypical Jew. We can know that academically, but we can't pretend that we're triggered on that the way others were 100 years ago. So our problems are more thematic and less instantly apparent to audiences than other works, or indeed than these used to be. But let's talk about Die Meistersinger. Yes, okay, now really quickly, in case this is a new idea for you, Die Meistersinger is Richard Wagner's only comedy, well, only mature comedy. It's good. It's actually good as a comedy. It's actually funny. I mean, it's not good as an opera. It's a flippin' masterpiece, and there's no question about that. In fact, when they did polls on of conductors for the millennium, all the famous conductors, and they said, what is your one desert island score, opera or non-opera? And by a long shot, Die Meistersinger won out. Partly because it is the longest single opera in the repertory. I'm here to tell you, our performance last week began at 5:55 and ended at 11:59. Barely in time. Peter Gell, my boss, is pulling out the 3 hairs he has left on his head, same as me, because if it goes 1 second past midnight, we pay quadruple time to 17 unions. Maestro Antonio Papano, man, he brought it in. There used to be, fun fact, there used to be a button. We don't have this now, but in the old Met, Rudolph Bing had a button that he would hit in his office, and the light would go on, the conductor says, conduct faster. So that's Die Meistersinger. What's it about? Okay, let's see if I can do this in 30 seconds. No, I do this actually for a living. It's the year is 1558 in the city, the ancient city of Nuremberg. You have a guild of master singers. These are tradespeople, middle-class people who have a passion for the art of master singing as it was practiced in that time and place. There are historical figures, Hans Sachs, who lived. If you attend if you use most Christian hymnals, you've sung some of his hymns. But he's a shoemaker and writes music on the side, very important. And this is at a moment of great transition at this community. It's in the middle of the Reformation, which is never called that as such in the libretto, but it's referred to in many ways. So a lot's going on, and there are lots of rules. It's all about rules. You got to follow the rules of how to make a master song. And David, our apprentice, our second tenor, this is the world of that opera. It says, there are 38 modes of the German master song. I will now demonstrate them for you, each and every one. So it's kind of in real time, which is why it's so long. It's very interesting. So what happens is, now this is weird, one of the master singers wants to show how much he honors art, so he's giving his greatest treasure to the winner of the competition that year, and that's his daughter. Is that weird? Yes, that's very weird. Whole separate issue to talk about. And there's the fussy, spotlights. The fussy town clerk is trying to marry her. Of course, he's not supposed to. A handsome knight, the wrong class, in a sense, wants to marry Ava, and he comes and he doesn't know how to make a master song, so they decide to teach him. But he's wild and impulsive and a rock and roller, literally. And he's got the soul of the music in him, but he doesn't know the rules. So where do we meet in the middle? And of course he wins, and he and Ava live happily ever after. That's it, right? That much is correct. Every line like All About Eve, like the script of All About Eve, every line can be taken out and extrapolated. And you can write books on it. I have done so. All right. Now, one of the things that happens, we always have to have the issue of who are we as a German nation, as German people, the folk. Very fetishized by the Third Reich word, partly because of its role in this opera, largely because of its role in this opera. as was their fetishization of Nuremberg in general in the Third Reich. And this was a question in the year this takes place, 1558, and this was a question in the year of the premiere of the opera, 1868. In Munich, when there was no nation of Germany yet. It was in the process of being formed. In 1558, there was this rather nebulous thing called the Holy Roman Empire that seemed to have something to do with being the German nation, but not. So there was a question of, well, what is the German nation? And this was a question that was going on all over Europe in its various forms for most other nations that were trying to be created at the time. There was no Czech nation yet. There was no Polish nation. Famously, there was no Italian nation. Farther over, there was France and Spain and Portugal as we know them today, but Middle Europa and Eastern Europe, no, they were trying to figure this out. And the process of doing that was a very fraught process. Okay. So now, when we talk about problems in Meistersinger, the first thing anybody's going to tell you is there's a final monologue that's a real problem. And Hans Sachs does say, when he's trying to get everyone together and saying, no, we need the best of old and new, and it's really great in art. And then he says, we need to do this because even now, the enemies are gathering around our country. Look out for them. And within our country, look out for them. The foreigners. The word he uses is Welche. Interesting word, and we'll come back to it. And of course, he has the famous line like, we need to hang on to our traditions, our artistic traditions, in order to create our nation. And he says, I should have written it down. I'm going to mess up German again. Ehrt eure Deutschen, yeah? Help me with that dative ending. No, accusative ending. Well, honor your German masters in terms of the teachers, the master singers. And the line itself, quoted out of context, is often read as obey your German masters. And it is very triggering. But it's not triggering to me. And and everyone apologizes for this monologue, which is Maestro Papano we interviewed him 2 days ago, and he was apologizing for it. I actually don't mind it. It doesn't trigger me. I see it. I see that Ehrt means honor, Meisters means teachers. Now, if I were in 1951 and had just experienced the Third Reich, I might not want to hear those words anyway, no matter how William Berger in Boston in 2021 is going to say you shouldn't be triggered by them. But the fact is I'm not. And it doesn't make me any more savvy to pretend that I am when I'm not. It doesn't put me in solidarity with victims of the Third Reich. In fact, it's a pose I don't qualify for. What are the problems in Meistersinger then? Well, it's that paranoia of right now they're at the border, the Welche, the foreigners. And that doesn't just mean invaders, although it means that too. If you've ever experienced Lohengrin, there's a lot of Nazi catnip in there about, the hordes from the east are ready to invade us and we have to unite and kick their armies out and so on and so forth. So there is a little bit of that, but it's also Welche descending from the same word we get, Guelph. If you've ever had to experience Italian literature or opera and, oh my God, the Ghibellines and the Guelphs, not that, endlessly confusing, but it's part of that. And Welche does bear within it this idea of specifically Latin, foreign, Roman Empire, French and Italian, those places that were part of the Roman Empire. If you've ever experienced Richard Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier, and you should, because it's a flippin' masterpiece also, that people don't even realize, the insult the servants, the Viennese servants, use on the Count Octavian Rofrano, who's one of these Italian-Austrian people, is Welcher. So it's like definitely, we have words that I'm not even going to repeat, but we have words that are specifically for Southern European, to insult Southern Europeans. And he uses this, again, trying to define his nationalism. And I get this. I get that, he says, well, I'll get to that. But, and earlier, before there was this same paranoia when Walter, the knight, comes in and he says, they're asking him, where did you learn how to sing? And he said, oh, in nature and with the old masters, Walter von der Vogelweide, which is like just so much fun to say. I have to say it every time. And he said, but I was out in nature and I was singing, but then an owl flew out of the bush and was jealous of me and wanted to get me. And he's referring to his rival in love, of course, but also this idea, there's got to be a bad guy. There's always got to be a bad guy. In politics, there's no conception of creating a nation without having the offset of an enemy in Richard Wagner's mindset. And, he has his reasons culturally, but, as Jean Renoir said, the truly frightening thing about life is everybody has their reasons. Compare Verdi, who is as nationalistic in his Italianism as Wagner is in his Germanism, but it doesn't seem to offend us so much. Why? Well, partly because we think of the ineptitude of Italian expansionists in the 20th century. They were lousy at it, so it's not as toxic. But it's beyond that. In many of Verdi's works, there is no bad guy. He can come up with a good one when he wants to, like Iago in Otello, but in lots of other ones, there is no bad, La Traviata, and so on. There's a quote, I should have written it, but I ought to know it by now, where he wrote in a letter during the wars of Italian independence, the Austrian army passed through his lands in the Parma region and actually blew up a few buildings as a parting gesture in their retreat in the town of Modena, and then left. And he wrote to a friend of his, they've gone, and may they go to their home and find their skies as beautiful as we find ours. And to me, this is the whole thing. There's none of this that you see everywhere about, caricaturing of the enemy. It's just, they should not be here, take your cannons and go home to your country. And I think that's a big difference. And there's not that paranoia. And German nationalism should be no more suspect than anyone else's nationalism, except in that form of delusional paranoia, as in Meistersinger, but also Lohengrin. It's there in Parsifal, and don't even get me started on the Ring of the Nibelung, because we haven't got time, but it's interesting. Maybe what I need to say is we learn from Wagner that we all need to check nationalism for signs of this paranoid delusion in our own and everywhere else. This is when nationalism becomes oppressive. And maybe I need to say right now that we Wagnerites can apply that to present day headlines when we read about the subhumans coming over the border from the South. I am Mexican-American, so I'm particularly sensitive to it, but mostly I'm human, and I realize, and I'm a Wagner fan, and I recognize the language and the signs and the symbols. And it's weird because I don't think, sorry, I popped. If you read Cosima Wagner, his wife, her diaries, 2,200 pages, they're not easy. But these weird moments come through of humanity, and she says, she's complaining about the British Empire's Zulu Wars. She says, by what right do they make war on the Zulus? Aren't the Zulus people exactly like us? Cosima Wagner, folks, out of the mouths of racist babes. There's another quote in there where Bismarck, who became the chancellor of the German nation when it finally happened, the Second Reich, passed a law restricting socialists from gathering. And Cosima was shocked. She was always saying what Richard Wagner, her husband, thought, or she thought he thought. And she said, can you imagine passing a set of laws against one group of people? Assessing the problems anew, going back to all this stuff over again, can also show us something else. This is pretty interesting. I was just in Charleston, South Carolina at a very old Charleston event talking about this stuff. And the question was, is the goal of this conversation to make white people feel bad? And I said, no, it's not the goal. It's just an added benefit if it happens. But one of the interesting things that happens when we shed some light, Luft, as Isolde says, on these issues is that some healing already happens from having talked about this in historical context. To wit, again, as I say, what may have been insufferably racist in 50 or 70 years ago might not be anymore. And again, we don't have to pretend to be offended by things that we might not actually be offended by anymore. Crazy. But I'll tell you what happened. We're doing Porgy and Bess at the Met also. There are some issues here. And I was doing a presentation on Porgy and Bess to a group of school children from Atlanta who had come up for it. All African American, all way too smart. You know, those like high school students that are like, I'm sorry, you're too smart. I just tone it down a bit. So there was this group, and I had the presence of mind to say, well, why don't you tell me a few things instead of me white-splaining to you why you shouldn't be offended by Porgy and Bess. And one of them said, well, here's something interesting. It was about the language. And I was, more on which in a moment, I was just speaking with Morris Robinson in LA doing one of these events. And, you know, he's older, and he was saying that the language was a problem. And I remember when Grace Bumbry did it originally at the Met, did Bess in the 80s, and she had a real problem with the language. In other words, it's the cliche of people in a black community speaking really bad English. Bess, you is my woman now. And this young woman said, you know, we, at this point in history, we don't think of this as bad English. We think of it as good Gullah. That this dialect that was understood in 1935 as bad English has come to be recognized as a language. The Bible has been translated into Gullah. That's always a good sign that, like, your language is coming of age. So it's not ghetto speak. It's a language that the young person doesn't need to feel ashamed of in the same way that an older person in 1985 did. And I think that is fascinating. You know, we weren't going to perform Guillaume Tell of Rossini at the Met for a long time because a lot of people said, oh, people will hear the Lone Ranger overture and start giggling. Well, maybe if you're over 80, that problem solved itself. That's why we have to keep the conversation going and keep asking the same questions anew. Then there's this issue. This gets thorny, but this is one thing that I've been hearing people talking about. And it's really interesting to me because gender and genre are the same word, as is genera, race, which comes from genus. Remember that from biology class, that nightmare, genus, species, and all that. what's going on with this issue? The issue is categories, how we categorize things. That is a big problem in exclusionism, let's call it. Racism, sexism, and everything is the idea of keeping things to binary categories or a limited number of categories. All binaries are hierarchical, except maybe under laboratory conditions. We learned this with Jim Crow. We learned this when people tell me God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. One, that's corny, but two, Adam's first. That's not coincidental. Okay, let me unpack this from a Wagnerian point of view and why this is an issue for us. Walter von Stolzing in Der Meistersinger doesn't only covet artistic excellence, how to write a good song, he also wants to use the song to win the object of his affection. In other words, and his rival in art, Sixtus Beckmesser, is not only his rival in art, but also wants the prize Eva. And come on, she's named Eva. That's not just any name. That's Eve. That's all woman. That's the proto-woman. So, their jealous feelings, and I mean jealous in the Virgilian sense, feelings of covetousness, and you're stepping on my rights, right? Those feelings that get into paranoid political delusion are erotic and aesthetic and political and racial, because they always are. There is no difference between those categories. Everything is all of these. Wagner and Eva both say, es gibt hier Kunst. What matters here is art. Turns out that they're wrong. Hans Sachs in Der Meistersinger tells us so. There is no art for art's sake. There's no Kunst over there. And we don't want there to be. That's actually good news. We who have studied the Gesamtkunstwerk of Richard Wagner, the total work of art, the idea that a work of art is more, it's not a thing over there, it's all-consuming at its best for the whole community, know that that means a lot more than people think it means. Hans Sachs tells us the Holy Roman Empire will pass away. And you remember what will survive. Holy German art will survive. So again, the empire, the Reich, is one thing. Kunst, art, is another, but they're in a relationship to each other, and it's a sacred relationship. And I think he's right. I think the marginalization of the arts is a problem. I hate it. I say this, I've said this to New York Times editors and writers at events like this. Why is it arts and leisure? Why isn't it arts and ideas? And then your investing and your politics and everything else is what you do in your leisure time after you've considered the real pithy and important ideas in the arts. That's what the Greeks did when they invented a lot of things like theater and democracy, not unrelated at the same time. So Hans Sachs tells us that the keeping things in their proper categories, across their proper borders, is bad. Interesting. Wagner himself knew he had a problem with categorization. Remember, he didn't want to call any of his works operas. I don't write operas. Donizetti wrote operas. And he used a very plain word to describe what he thought of Donizetti's operas. Good, literally Anglo-Saxon word. He didn't want to be associated with others, but you know what? I've come to learn, neither does anyone else in the arts. I write a lot of band bios, band promos, and they always, for new music. And they always tell me, well, yeah, but we're not exactly that. We're kind of deathcore, but we're a little not. And then there are definitely prog influences, and we're not like that. And it's like that with everything. That we're really moving beyond genre as we move beyond gender binaries. Let me keep going because I'd love to riff on that for a while. But here's an interesting case of genre-gender confluence. Hans von Bülow, who enters our story many times in the most curious ways, Cosima Wagner's first husband. First? Yeah. And Richard Wagner's favorite conductor, even after some messy personal situations. Well, he went to hear Verdi's Requiem, premiered in 1874. And also, interesting, we have very conflicting information, again, in Cosima's diaries, about what Richard Wagner actually thought of Verdi's Requiem. It's always assumed that he hated it, but she said, as far as what Richard thought of the Requiem, the less said, the better. Well, that can mean a lot of things. And in other places, he was said to have admired it. But, okay, for now, that doesn't matter. Hans von Bülow famously dismissed it as Oper in Kirchgewande, opera in church dress. He never complained about the music in it. Who could? Verdi Requiem is one of the... God's going to judge the human race and say, yeah, they're awful and lousy and they've had wars and misery. Of course, they are the species that created Act 2 of Mozart's Nozze di Figaro and the Verdi Requiem. So, okay, we'll let them live. I think it is that great of a masterpiece. And it disturbed Bülow. And it disturbed Bülow because it blurred binaries. It was musical transvestitism. It was opera dressed as something else. What if it is? What if it's... Why does there need to be such a border between operatic music and liturgical music? Francis Toy once said, best phrase in his career, commentator in the 1920s, if this music is more appropriate for the opera house than the church, so much the worse for the church. And Bülow later wrote Verdi and said, I'm sorry, that was wrong. This is the greatest masterpiece ever. Any idiot can tell that. To the part, Verdi wrote him back a very nice letter and then wrote to other people and said, is Bülow all right? And it turned out he wasn't. He was mentally ill and was committed shortly after, but it is interesting. Nico Muhly, our composer, very interesting. He was at an event. In fact, you were there, I think. That's so weird. But people were always, as a new composer, people were asking him, I didn't plan this, what are you? Are you a new classical composer? Are you well, he's not a neo-classical composer, clearly. Are you an alt-classical composer? What are you? And, let's categorize you. I don't know what you are until I get you in my binary system. And he said, Nico's very energetic, and he said, let's see if you remember this. He said, the categories of what kind of music I write only ever mattered to the guy at Tower Records who had to figure out where to put the recordings, and he's not around anymore. And I had a zoinks moment. I was like, zoinks. Like, it mattered in 1975 what genre of music you were composing. It doesn't matter that way anymore. And I thought that was really interesting. Okay. So how do we get beyond these grim iron curtains to a place of inclusivity? What does that mean? Okay, I'll tell you. You didn't think I could, but I will. We don't solve the problems of oppression in the arts by denying their existence or by canceling the arts. That only makes them stealthily toxic. It doesn't make the problems go away, unfortunately. We address racism and sexism in the arts by addressing the context of how we present them. What is context? Well, I'll tell you. It's everything that interprets the work of art. And since there is always context by existential definition, there is always interpretation. Now, I know, you go to the opera and you say, I really don't want anybody preaching at me. I don't want a concept from someone else. Well, you're getting one way or another. Sometimes it's just more obvious than other times. All facts come with points of view. So you could talk about the context of the art as it's presented on the stage, we could talk about it backstage, and we could talk about in the venue and environment in which it is experienced. Hold on. There's no clock in here, and that's dangerous. Aha. Okay. Spate Jenkins from Seattle Opera once said, again, in List Hall, in good old List Hall, and I went, zoinks. He said, the two most difficult things to put on stage in opera are difficult for the same reason. It's the character of Carmen and the dragon in Siegfried. And the reason is that everybody in the audience comes in with an idea of what it should be. So you cannot do that. In other words, there's no way to make seen that which cannot be seen. The thing that cannot be seen is your preconception of what the character of Carmen, the Uber woman, is, and what the dragon in Siegfried should look like. It's kind of fun to watch them get it wrong. Now, I was doing it, yes, I'm totally hyping again. But I was just talking with Jamie Barton, who did write the foreword to my book, which is really interesting. And Jamie is self-identified. Jamie is a great mezzo-soprano. She's been singing more Wagner. She was Fricka at the Met in the Ring of the Nibelung. She just sang Brangäne into Son und Isolde in, I think, Orange, somewhere in Europe. And in fact, I wrote her when she was learning Brangäne in rehearsal. And I said, this might be the best or the worst time to ask you a big ask right now. And it turned out to be good. But she identifies as an activist. She says her art is activism. And specifically, the issues about which she is passionate is identity issues, as she identifies as a bisexual, polyamorous woman who is also an activist in sizeism, something I hadn't thought about so clearly. And her issue, I was in Chicago to see her performing Carmen with Chicago Opera Theater, yes. Carmen with the Don José, the tenor role, performed by Stephanie Blythe. In her non-binary persona of blithely Sant'Antonio or something. It's fabulous. Okay, so she did with a beard on. That was very interesting, but I didn't even get around to talking about that. But just Jamie Barton brought up the idea of gender, genre, and genus, type in Carmen and in choosing repertory. The question is, who gets to play what? Who gets to channel what to you? And this has been an issue in race in terms of being on stage. It still is in a different way. How do you cast, can you cast people in different races? It's more complicated than you would think. I'll get to that in a moment. But Jamie was saying that there were many companies who said, we will give you Carmen. By the way, if you're a mezzo-soprano, you wake up every morning of your life and say, please, God, give me a Carmen production. It's just the way it is. The voice voice is destiny. Voice is identity. You can sing that. You want to sing Carmen. Because Heather, are you a mezzo? Yeah. Am I right? Yeah. Okay. So have I, but you don't want to hear it. Because Carmen is everything. She's a lot of things. It's a fascinating character. But above all, one thing that it requires is, for lack of a better word, it requires a level of sexiness. Like, you have to believe somehow that everybody is attracted to this woman, and attracted in a very fleshy way as well as a spiritual way. So it wasn't so much a matter of, for me, I mean, it was interesting the way it came out, because I've seen Carmens of various sizes and Carmens of various appearances, and what works is when Carmen owns her own power. The person playing Carmen owns her own attractiveness. Whatever it is, that can be purely vocal, too. I mean, we've all melted at Luciano Pavarotti's voice, and the tension between what we're seeing and hearing was part of I Can't Believe My Eyes, is part of the process of how we get beyond appearances in opera. But Jamie came out and she was hot. And the first thing Carmen sings is Habanera, right? And it's basically everybody wants me, everybody loves me, She's singing a song. She's actually performing for people, which is weird in an opera, but that happens sometimes. Carmen almost always does it. She's almost always performing. And I could tell that that person inside the character had decided that she was hot. And so she was. But it was an interesting operatic look beyond what passes for appearances into true appearances. If that makes any sense, I've got to work with that phrase. But it's also who gets to play what is part of the context of detoxifying these works. And then I was in LA with Morris Robinson. And he has a lot to say. And he has a lot to say specifically about being a black man on the operatic stage. And what he brought up was, it's not enough to have me, Morris Robinson, out front as like, look, we're diverse. And he's noticed that he's been used that way quite a bit. Like, go out, be black, visibly. And he brought up the point that it also involves backstage and media and everybody else. And hold on, I'll come back to that. First, I interviewed Amy Tan and David Henry Hwang in my book on Turandot. And they both, they had interesting things to say. David Henry Hwang was saying, Turandot and Madame Butterfly of Puccini are two very different works. One is fantasy and one is realism of some sort. And so we have to treat the idea, what do we see on stage, differently. And Amy Tan was saying, and Du Yun also, that we had an event at the Museum of Chinese in America in New York, which was great. Du Yun said, if you think of me, she's from China, a woman who is a composer, said, if you look at the Princess Turandot on stage and think of me, we've got a problem there. If you think that has anything to do with me, that's a problem of racism. And I was like, that's pretty interesting. Turandot being a Persian story via Italy. But David Henry Hwang said, but you have to be careful, because by saying something is realism or something isn't, doesn't solve the problem of what you're seeing on stage in terms of character and the people interpreting it for you, which becomes an issue in Wagner, because Die Meistersinger is, in a sense, Wagner's only work in any sense of realism. So when we have Hans Sachs saying things, it's a different case than when we have the gods and creatures of the Ring of the Nibelung acting out archetypes. But neither of which is free from the questions. Okay, moving on here. Then Gary Rosen, who I was speaking with in LA, screenwriter, said that don't we have to question the politics of backstage, of the unions? No one had ever mentioned this to me before. They were just about to go on strike in LA, the writers' union, but they didn't, thank goodness. But no one ever questioned this to me, and I'm here to tell you that at least in New York, in Germany, there are family preferments in unions. If your father, and there are many bureaucratic ways in which families, there are legacy preferments, so that in a sense, union membership is almost, not quite, but almost de facto hereditary. And there's a lot of that in New York too, in the theater unions. So if we have a monolithically white union, and we do, and a monolithically straight and a monolithically male union, we have 17 of them. Well, no, they're not all that. Say a dozen of them. Does that affect the context of what we're saying a work like Meistersinger is? It does. You don't think it does, but it does. On a very maybe indirect level, but it's kind of interesting. Then, real quickly, and I'm sure Dahlia is going to say, no, wait, don't go off on this tangent because we'll be here until Shavuos. But another issue with contexts, and we have talked about it, but we have to keep talking about it because it's different than it was 7 years ago when we talked about it, is, this whole idea of traditional, it's not like this, but it's still the way people talk about, that I want a traditional production versus an interpretive production. In other words, when you have, oh my God, read the reviews of Meistersinger at the Met just from last week. There's so much discussion about, and people were coming at me with, oh, it's so good to see a production, basically an old-fashioned production, which, when they say we're on a street in Nuremberg, you see a street in Nuremberg instead of a mall in New Jersey or whatever, in something a little more interpretive. And there is a tendency to, especially in Germany, to associate something that is representational, that is literal and representational with right-wing politics, and an urge to classify something that is more freely interpreted with left-wing politics. And it's not exactly like that, but it's close enough to keep it the discussion. So we need to have more discussions about that. Neither one is inherently political, almost, but not quite. However, and this is huge, insisting that we will only do one kind or the other is. And that is totalitarian. And it's a real problem, and it exists. The Third Reich said you had to have representational scenery in all opera productions. So did the Soviet Union, socialist realism. They got rid of the great Russian traditions of constructivism and all these explosion of the arts after the revolution. Nope. In fact, they killed the Symphony of Meyerhold. Nope, we don't like your work. And in fact, it's pretty funny because I have a friend who's more right-wing than I am. Well, anybody's more right-wing than I am. But he said, so isn't it equally totalitarian if you say you can't have any traditional productions? And I wanted to say, oh, don't come at me with cancel culture and your concern. And then I had to say, yeah, you're right. It is. I wish I didn't have to say that. And here's an important one. This is a new thing I want to bring up. The venue, the actual physical space where we experience the performing arts. And I don't mean to be mean to Chicago Symphony Hall, and Jay, don't get mad at me, but I'm going to walk over for a minute. You can barely see there, but Chicago Symphony Hall has the names of Beethoven, Schubert, Wagner at the Symphony Hall, Bach, and Mozart. All German names. They're telling you what is going on here, right? And they're not just telling you, like, those are all great artists, of course, but the style in which they're telling you, the design, it's an interesting point. The design is Roman temple architecture. It's those Roman letters. In fact, what I have here is the proscenium of the old Metropolitan Opera House, which I know many people miss, but I want to point out something. Jay, don't get mad. There's the same sort of writing, and it's Mozart, Gluck, Gounod, that's big of them. A Frenchman. Okay, he opened the house, but Beethoven, who of course wrote one opera, and so on. And they're there not only in the same letters, but in the signs and symbols of Roman civic religion. In the Roman Empire, there was no separation between church and state. We worship, in theory, the state gods. And the state gods are represented right there, the lyre of Apollo, the acanthus leaf, which is also on our money. In other words, this isn't a forum of ideas. This is a temple of art. And the art is the state religion, and Wagner, who's in there, is meant to be venerated. I don't want to venerate anybody, least of all Wagner. I want that which is eternal in his art. So as much as I know a lot of the old-timers love the old Met, that was wrong. That turned the art into something it didn't need to be. Stefan Lissner was the head of La Scala somewhere else, and is now at the San Carlo Opera in Naples, probably the most beautiful theater in the world. And he made headlines. It's a good article, but the headline was, "Opera must leave its ivory tower." Of course, meanwhile, he made sure he got the picture of himself at the world's most beautiful and oldest continuously operating opera house, I believe, the San Carlo. But it was an interesting point he was making, if you get beyond the headline. It's like the importance of what we're saying with the place where art happens is part of what we're saying the art is, and part of the definition of what it is. Wait, it gets bigger. Remember I said there was no difference between art, religion, and the state in the Roman Empire, and we're still living out the Roman Empire here? Okay, remember this? This is weird. On December 21st of 2020, President Trump signed an executive order mandating the use of neoclassical architecture in all federal buildings. It was one of the last acts of the Trump administration. The day after, the American Institute of Architects said, that's a terrible idea. And on February 25th, in other words, one of the first acts of the Biden administration, that executive order was countermanded. So we're not just talking about a recherché subject of art. Remember, it's not arts and leisure. Arts, and that includes design, and that includes the physical spaces that we're in, are intensely political. Now, this issue really got to me because, let me tell you something. Again, like with Wagner, I've always liked it. I like neoclassical architecture. I don't want to be a totalitarian because I like it. It has to have a place. So the architecture itself is not inherently this way or that way politically. Classical architecture in its original Athenian form represented the highest ideals of democracy and theater. You're sitting in one. Well, you're actually sitting in a version of the Bayreuth Festival House, by Wagner with the sloped auditorium, but we'll get to that. Probably not today. The totalitarianism isn't in the architecture, it's in the legislation of the architecture. And it's the same with productions and everything else. Okay. There has to be room for both old and new, as we learn from de Meistersinger. The answer is in dialogue. Dialogue like this and dialogue like these tedious town meetings we have, and so on and so forth. Democracies in the dialogue. Okay, beyond the buildings then, context, marketing, audience development. We hired a diversity officer at the Met, and I'm getting a lot of pushback on it from people. They're like, wait, does that mean they're going to hire artists of color over white people? It's like, I don't think so. I don't know. I mean, I had to speak to the diversity officer where she was saying, like, we can't just make this stuff for old white guys. And I said, wait, I'm now an old white guy. I never saw the day coming. But I need you to understand that I had to fight for my seat at the Opera House the same as other people did. There wasn't a red carpet laid out for me. This isn't 1820. But we had that dialogue, and we were able to. Besides, I was very surprised to find myself being defined as an old white guy because I was a radical Latino youth just the other day, but hey, you know, it happens. Okay. Another thing we can learn from de Meistersinger, and I'll kind of wrap up with this, is a warning how not to do it. Because Hans Sachs doesn't get it right, and he doesn't get it wrong in the way people think he does. But the question is, so if we're doing this for the community, who is the community? And in the arts, we have to expand. Even no matter what's right or wrong, we have to grow the audience. There are 8 times as many people as there were the year Wagner and Verdi were born. So we have to multiply 8-fold just to be where we were in 1813. And more. But also because the classics are evolutionary and they can hold up to expansion and get beyond their original meanings. I meant to pop that. Hans Sachs rightly pointed to the folk, the people, as the ultimate arbiters of art. He said, why don't we open this contest? You know, the whole thing's a song contest. It's like Franconian Idol. He says, why don't we open the contest to public opinion? They say, are you nuts? Have you seen them? The public? What do they know? That part's right. What's wrong is who is the public? Are Jews part of the German public? Well, that's not addressed in de Meistersinger directly, but are Catholics? No. If you worship in a foreign language, Welscher language, you're not authentically German. And that goes back to the comments about backstage and onstage. I wish he would have found a way to say yes. But I'm not part of that debate. I wasn't part of that debate in the German nation in 1868, but I am part of it now, just as a human being, like the same question in France today. Remember the Je suis Charlie and Hebdo and the whole thing with they printed an image of the Prophet Muhammad and got a bomb in response. And the debate after this was wrongly framed, that it was an issue of freedom of the press. It's not an issue of freedom of the press. The press does not have the right to print what is unprintable to members of the community. You cannot print pornography willy-nilly. You cannot print, or let me do something even more directly of concern to American people. I can't print your financial information because that's sacred. And we all agree. And if somebody disagrees with that, we say, well, you're crazy, so you're not part of the community. You don't get a vote because the insane don't, just like some felons don't. So what they were saying was not that we have the right to print this image. What we were saying is the people who object to it are not part of the community. Muslims are not true French people. And I wish they would have found a way to say that, to think that through differently. They have to decide that. I know what I hope they decide. I'm not French or Jewish or Muslim, but it affects me as a human being. Okay, I'll wrap up with the good news. What is it? The classics can handle this sort of scrutiny. They come out stronger. The Aeneid has, the Divine Comedy of Dante. The question is, can we? Can we in the audience, can we as Wagner fans handle these sorts of questions? Ultimately, each of us, individually and collectively, are the context that defines the art. Who are we and what historical baggage do we bring? Who is the person sitting next to us in the theater or the cinema? Who's the person on stage? Who's their boss? Who paid for this? Are we going to stick to an original idea in its outward forms, or are we going to evolve? In other words, and here's my great brain fry discovery, to go back to the Ring of the Nibelung. I mean, we could be Hans Sachs and get both of them, but get it the right way. We could be Alberich in the Ring, or we could be Brünnhilde. Alberich is like, but wait, that day you took my ring and that was wrong, and I'm going to hold my breath and turn blue, literally, until I get it back. Or, remember Brünnhilde, I know everything. I get it. I know everything, everything, everything. Whenever they say something 3 times in an opera, pay attention. We have to evolve to the next era. I have to throw the ring in the fire. And you get to choose. You have to choose if you're going to be Alberich or Brünnhilde. It's amazing that the answers to the problems that are set forth in the Ring are found in the Ring, and same in Meistersinger. Are we going to be Hans Sachs or Sixtus Beckmesser? I was interviewing Hans Martin Krenzler, and he was saying, notice that you can sing both roles, the same voice. Interesting. Okay. I could go on, but I'm not going to. I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit longer, but really when you consider the scope of this, I think I've been rather economical. I hope you feel the same way. It's warm in here. Let me wrap up, and let me ask, I meant to ask if anybody has any questions, and be nice. Oh, no, please, give me a question first, then we'll applaud. Okay, Dahlia. The question is the Verdi Requiem more of an, I'll repeat it here.
Oh.
Or you want to repeat it? Okay.
Is the Verdi Requiem not opera, but more oratorio?
And the answer is yes. But I think from what I've learned with Jamie and elsewhere, the question we need to be asking is not so much what category it is, but what are the complex, nuanced, and phenomenal issues within that piece of work. Just like with each other, sometimes I think with individuals, the gender genre thing, it's less important if it's not a black and white situation and anymore. And that's our identity, is mixed, whether we're talking about gender or race. Okay, this is interesting. All 4 of my grandparents were immigrants from Russia, Lithuania, Palestine, Italy, and Mexico. What am I? You got to see me stress out on the census forms. For 60 years, I've been checking off other. And, you know, I'm sort of at a place. The first book launch thing I did, I had a metalhead friend of mine, you really have to meet, interview me, and he asked, "What's your mission here?" Which I thought was really interesting. And because no one had asked me that, and I think that's a good question to ask anybody when they're out and about. And I said, you know what, I'm done apologizing. I'm done apologizing for loving opera. I'm done apologizing for loving Wagner. And that felt like a coming out that I did. And it comes out through the Verdi Requiem that it's like, Herr von Bülow, what matters here is the masterpiece, and it's nuanced and complex, as is everybody in the audience, rather than, it's not in the right category. What is it? It's a drama of life and death, the Verdi Requiem, in music. I don't know what that is. It's really good. Hi.
Hi, I have a question.
Yes,
and
please.
I actually have a few questions, and I'm trying to figure out how to best formulate them.
It kind of snowballs, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. The thing that kind of strikes me about the current issues when it comes to diversity, which obviously the opera industry and many performance-based industries have an issue with diversity, which I'm glad that we're having the conversation for it. But in what role, especially at a place like the Met, does economics kind of fit into the equation?
Well, my dear.
And when it comes to, and also when it comes to economics, you know, you think about the Met and producing opera on this huge grand scale. Would it be maybe helpful for the Met to have some kind of black box theater of some kind, where you could produce opera that would be on a smaller level, more intimate level, where you could bring them into communities and you could share them more readily?
The Mini Met. Been trying to get it since 1883. I'm not even kidding. They had it, the new theater, for a while in, I think it was 1910, in the time of, you know, David Belasco, and when the Met had unlimited money. But anyway, I'm sorry. That's that question, but.
It's just with the
Economics.
There was kind of that, but also the economics when it comes to diversity, because you have all sorts of people who are kind of holding the door when it comes to kind of being introduced to new talent and the opportunities for new talent to kind of be heard and seen and appreciated. And it kind of seems, you know, you mentioned the unions and the, you know, the all-white leadership and you know, even when but there's all sorts of kind of like, you know, hardened kind of structural things that are kind of baked into the industry, where it's like I see this conversation about diversity happening, which is fantastic, but sometimes I wonder if it's ever going to really, really and truly stick, because a lot of these kind of structural things that are happening are still there, and nobody's dealing with them. So,
well,
what role does
that's not
addressing?
entirely true, that
Yeah.
nobody's dealing with them. They're not dealing with them rapidly enough for most of our tastes, but the conversation is opening also in San Francisco, and I've been sitting on Zoom meetings, God help us, you know, on this. And the point that you bring up that is a primary interest is how do the economics affect the policies, and what can be done about that? And that's a very good question. But of course, one thing you could do is, you know, this has always been the question with opera. I don't need to tell you, the stuff is expensive to produce. The second opera that was ever produced, the first was produced in an academic colloquium, whatever you call it, consortium. Just like us, people who were like really smart said, let's do a thing, and they invented it, and it's like, wow, what even is it? Let's just call it opera.
Yeah.
The second was produced for a royal wedding, because that's how much it costs.
Yeah.
And it does, and there is no way around that, and the more grassroots you are, the more it costs proportionately.
Right.
As you know. So of course, we could fund this with the government, but then you're a commie, pinko, un-American if you ask for money. But that has to happen in order for the funding to be representational of the people for whom it is directed, to whom it is directed. But, we're not close to that right now. And I'll tell you something else. This is really weird. I'll bet you didn't know this. Do you remember the name Mrs. Donald Harrington? She was a very great patron of the Met and a grand lady, a Harrington of the New York 400. Wow. And one of the most inherently chic people I've ever seen. I used to stare at her in the box. She had her own box. And she would just sit there. It's like, why can't I sit like that? You know, just completely, here I am. Not pompous. She was just magnificent. And she basically paid for about 15 of the Met seasons. You still hear, we just did it with Turandot, a gift of Mrs. Donald P. Harrington. How much is it? Mrs. Harrington had a writer on her, whatever it was, that every production she paid for at the Met, which was almost every production for about 15 years, had to be representational. You had to see a tree in Hunding's hut in Act One of Die Valkyrie, or she wasn't paying for it. And I don't really have a problem with her, because she was very clear in what she wanted and what she was going to pay for. Okay, what am I going to tell you? No, you should like the things I like? Yeah, I mean, I do tell people that, but, you know, I don't expect them to listen, least of all when they're covered in diamonds. And, but the question is, for the Met, well, how can we do that? Well, we don't do that anymore. So right away, that's economic progress. And we do have people who write checks, but they don't have writers like that anymore. That's progress. But it's evolutionary, and we need to get to a point where the funding represents what goes on stage, because the golden rule, who has the gold makes the rules. It's a good point. Thank you for bringing it up.
All right, so does my voice come through the mask? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So basically, I have a two-part question. So one of it is that for Wagner, I know that he was very involved in the circles of revolutionary nationalists during 1848. Do you see the failure of opera in the 19th century as a failure of revolutionary movements in Europe that were forming the nation state? As a Belgian, our revolution began in an opera house in Brussels, right? So it was very much part of the culture that opera was the secular theater of the people, and that it was more as the societies developed, opera and other public culture could replace state religion and the reference of Catholicisms, etc. So do you see Wagner's failure finding the paranoias as maybe a kind of a failure of this revolutionary nationalist program to create popular sovereignty in nation states? Second point I would try to push a little bit is that when we talk about the inclusivity, you were mentioning like in France with Charlie Hebdo, you know, somebody who grew up reading the comic books and stuff and knowing the character, you know, not knowing, but through the comics who were murdered. I think the failure is that laicity in France and in Europe is a revolutionary heritage. It's not the exclusion of people, but it's the abolition of false practices, and it's a form of popular sovereignty, that the state represents the people and the people exercise a supreme will. How do you respond to that connected to the failure maybe in Wagner's opera and the fact that there was a progressive revolutionary perspective to nationalism in the late 18th, 19th century and into the 19th century?
The failure was in defining who the people were and having a too narrow vision of who we were. And it's a failure that's being repeated today by us. And oh my God, we have got to duke this out like over endless coffees. I cannot wait. So I'm meeting so many of you face to face for the first time today. It's very exciting. It's like there's something about not being on Zoom that makes me just want to say no. And another thing, and that's a good thing. Yes, sir.
When you put your slide up there about basically representationalism and avant-garde and productions, it almost seemed like it was just a dichotomy, whereas I think it's more a continuum of different production types, from the kind of extreme we get at Bayreuth these days to something a little less so and more, and a mix of traditional and avant-garde. I'm thinking of the Met Ring with its machine whip, but people were still wearing helmets and capes and eye patches and so on like that. The kind of stuff in the middle I don't feel is that bad, quite frankly. I think I like it more than either type sometimes, depending on how well it's done. Just wonder what your thoughts might be on that.
Well, the problem is I have so many, and I do want to, and in fact, I want to come back like right away and as soon as possible, and talk about that where we are now, because you're absolutely right, and it actually pains me and violates me to have this slide here, because, and Dahlia's listened to this talk, it is not a dichotomy, and that it's much more complex than that, and there are issues of, there are issues of nationalism, there are issues of, now there are issues of historicity. In other words, now you can put on a retro production, and you're making if you were to put on the 1876 ring now, you're not seeing the 1876 ring, you're seeing a modern monument to the 1876 ring, and so on and so forth. And plus, besides, there's new representational, and there's completely abstract, of course, the Wieland Wagner ideal of just this is no place, and therefore it's every place, and all that, which is fabulous. What do we do with that? So I think that it was really churlish of me to throw this in here and say, okay, now we're not really going to talk about this and then move on, because that's irresponsible. But you're right, and we need to talk about that more. One thing I didn't talk about that I want to, real quick about that, is in the neoclassical, it's that the thing itself, whether it's got a tree in it or it doesn't have a tree, or it has a traffic light that's supposed to be a tree, isn't its political identity. How we interpret that is its political identity. And for that, I do the neoclassical. The thing on the left is something that never happened. This was a plan by a student of Albert Speer's, but not Albert Speer, looks like Albert Speer, that Hitler was very excited about, was in fact diverting major war resources during the middle of the war to get this construction going until it simply wasn't possible, thank goodness, anymore with the war. But this was going to be the sort of renovation of the Bayreuth Festival House. And as you can see, it's subsumed into the sort of architecture you see at the, not coincidentally, Nuremberg rally grounds, the architecture of Albert Speer. And it's perfectly horrible. It's not perfectly horrible aesthetically, it's perfectly horrible because of how it was meant to come about. I mean, it is perfectly horrible aesthetically, but that's another story. It's very similar to the thing on the right, which is a model, which was a model I found somebody who was teaching about the birth of democracy, which is very analogous to that. So the politics are not in the look of the production, they're in everything else, the backstory of it. Did that anywhere come close to addressing what you were asking? Kind of, yeah, okay. Kind of is as good as it gets here, okay. Anything else? Okay. Dahlia, did you want to say anything about the Wagner Society, which you should have done I should have let you do it. Okay, well, there is the Boston Wagner Society, and they've got a table, and yes.
Okay, I started the Boston Wagner Society 18 years ago, and it's still going. We have an event coming up on November 10th, which is on Zoom. It's a lecture with vocal samples about the ring cycle. They're both musicians.
Oh, good.
The lecturer is a marvelous conductor by the name of Hugh Keelan, and the soprano is fabulous, Jenna Ray. They're a husband and wife team who hang out in Vermont, and they have a company called Tundi Productions, which was very successful when they did their Tristan und Isolde.
Oh, right.
So come and join us. Go to our website, bostonwagnersociety.org. Thank you.
So it's a case of the lecturer will make music, but don't worry, it's not like when I have to sing an example, which I've been doing, which is really dreadful, but you know that part in the Verdi Requiem where it goes la la la. No, yeah. Okay, so yes, and I will thank you also, and I will also tell you I partly have a book on sale, but I partly didn't get the box delivered, so I've only got a couple of copies of Seeking the Sublime Cache, which addresses a lot of these issues. It's previously published articles with new commentary around it. For example, there's a Verdi Requiem article that's 4 pages long and 20 pages of new commentary. No, what I meant to say was, and so it's kind of neat that way. So that's there. I have another book that is very expensive but very cheap too. It's $30, but it was $100 online. I do not know why. Was talks I gave before the Ring of the Nibelung at the 2018 performances in New York, and actually it's really good. I mean, it's not good because it's brilliant. It's good because it's talking about you approach the largest work of art ever produced. How? What do you do? And I think that's kind of neat. So that's out there. There's someone there to help you with that. If you don't have anything, take one of the cards that has my website, has my Instagram, and my email is the same as my Instagram, plus at gmail.com. Write me. I want to hear from you. I want to know when you're coming to New York at the opera. I want to see you. I want to do more of these things. I want to do different versions of this, including you all. And I want to do it in other places, and let's keep this all going because I'm serious. I thought I was going out on a book tour, and what I was doing was going out on a listening tour. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Boston Public Library. Vera, I love you guys. Jay, thank you. This is great.